Dawn, the Safed-Co Mountains, eastern Afghanistan, October 1986. The first light bleeds a pale grey over the jagged peaks. Below, in the valley floor's deep shadow, a sound breaks the cold silence. Not the call to prayer, but the low, grinding diesel grow of a Soviet military column. A BTR-60 armoured personnel carrier, its green paint scarred to bare metal, leads a snaking line of trucks and BMP infantry fighting vehicles along the dirt track of the Jalalabad-Asadabad road. Dust, thick and chalky, plumes behind them, settling on the shoulders of a young rifleman, Private Anatoly Ivanov, perched in the BTR's open hatch. He squints against the grit, his knuckles white on the PKT machine gun. His eyes scan the steep, boulder-strewn slopes rising on either side. Nothing moves but the dust. The column slows to navigate a hairpin bend. The engine noise echoes off the rock. In that moment of acoustic confusion on a ridge 800 meters to the north, a Mujahideen mountain lion sees his chance. He hefts a launch tube onto his shoulder, not the bulky, unreliable SA-7 of years past. This is something new, slender, with a distinct, boxy gripstock. He acquires the target, a Mi-24 Hind helicopter providing lazy, circling overwatch ahead of the column. The seeker head locks with a low electric hum. He exhales. A soft whoosh, not a roar. A thin streak of white smoke and fire lances silently from the ridge, accelerating to Mach 2 in seconds. In the Hind's cockpit, the pilot has a half-second warning, a frantic chirp from his radar warning receiver, a system designed for NATO fighters, not man-portable missiles. He yanks the collective, flares for evasion. It is too late. The fireball is sudden, blinding, a sun blooming at treetop level. The sound, a massive, wet crump, reaches Anatoly a heartbeat later, followed by the rain of falling metal and burning fuel. The column jerks to a halt. Officers shout, soldiers dismount into chaotic firing positions, their AK-74s cracking uselessly at the distant, empty ridge. The mountain lion and his team are already gone, melting into the labyrinth of caves and goat trails. The ambush is complete. No close assault, no massed charge. Just a single, precise, technologically superior strike from over the horizon of Soviet expectation. The war has changed. The doctrine has shifted, and the men in the valley are now targets in a new kind of killing field. This single violent event was not an anomaly, but the culmination of a relentless 7-year pressure campaign, a campaign engineered thousands of miles away, designed to exploit the fundamental weaknesses of a military colossus built for a different war entirely. To understand the shock of that moment in the Kunar Valley, one must first understand the machine that rolled into Afghanistan in December 1979, and the world it was built to conquer. The decision to invade was not taken lightly, but it was taken with profound institutional arrogance. In the crisp, hushed corridors of the Kremlin and the Soviet General Staff, Afghanistan was viewed through the dual lens of empire and ideology. The Marxist-Leninist government of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, in Kabul, fractious and repressive, was teetering under a nationwide insurgency. For General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and his inner circle, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, KGB Chief Yuri Andropov, and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, the calculus seemed clear. A failure to act risked the collapse of a socialist ally on their southern border, a potential domino that could destabilize Soviet Central Asia. The spectre of American or Chinese influence filling the vacuum was unacceptable. It would be a limited contingent operation. In, stabilize, and out. The instrument for this surgical intervention was the Soviet Armed Forces, the largest standing military in human history, a force honed and optimized for a single apocalyptic scenario, the Third World War on the plains of Europe. This was the Red Army's DNA. Its doctrine, its organization, its very soul was forged for high-tempo, large-scale, combined arms warfare against NATO. This was a war of fronts, not of frontiers. It envisioned colossal tank armies, echeloned in depth, smashing through the Fulda Gap, supported by vast artillery barrages and regimental waves of tactical aircraft. Success depended on centralized control, rigid timetables, and the overwhelming application of massed armor, massed firepower, massed troops. Initiative at the junior officer level was discouraged. The plan was supreme. Soldiers were conscripts serving 2-year terms, trained for this specific conventional grind. Their loyalty was to the unit, the motherland, and the political officers who ensured ideological purity. This was the army that entered Afghanistan on Christmas Eve, 1979. Operation Storm 333, the assault on Tajbeg Palace and key Kabul installations, was a spectacular, brutal success, a special forces operation that showcased precision and ruthlessness. The initial invasion force, the 40th Army, was built around elite airborne and motorized rifle divisions. They swiftly seized cities, highways and airfields. Politburo members in Moscow examined maps showing secured lines of communication and assumed the bandits would be mopped up in months. They had intervened in a civil war, they believed, not started a new one. They failed to comprehend the land they had entered. Afghanistan was not the German plain. It was a geographic fortress, a nation of 250,000 square miles, dominated by the Hindu Kush, a labyrinth of valleys, passes and caves where the population was dispersed, tribal and fiercely independent. The road network was primitive. Off it, the terrain was a nightmare for mechanized forces. The climate swung from searing 120-degree Fahrenheit summers in the deserts to paralyzing sub-zero winters in the mountains. This was a country that had spent centuries consuming foreign armies, from the British Empire to the armies of Alexander. It did not just resist invasion, it metabolized it, turning the invader's strength into a fatal weakness. And almost immediately, the signs of dislocation appeared. The Soviet convoy that rolled triumphantly into Kabul in 1980 was not an occupying army settling in for a long stay. It was an expeditionary force expecting a quick victory parade. They brought their European-style tactics with them: large, road-bound columns, heavy reliance on armour and artillery, set-piece-based defences. Their opponent was not a symmetrical force waiting to be engaged. It was a ghost. The initial resistance was fragmented, local and poorly armed. Tribal Lashkars fought with pre-World War II British Lee Enfield rifles, personal knives and captured Soviet equipment. But they held two decisive advantages: an absolute mastery of the terrain and the unwavering support, or at least the acquiescence, of the rural population. They were not holding ground, they were the ground. A Soviet column would travel a secured road by day, only to have that same road become a killing zone at night, its bridges blown, its culverts mined with homemade explosives. The 40th Army's initial response was to apply more force, larger sweeps, heavier bombardments of suspect villages. This succeeded primarily in creating more refugees, more hatred, and more recruits for the Mujahideen. By 1982, what the Kremlin had hoped would be a police action had solidified into a grinding, indecisive conflict. The Soviet war machine, a Formula One car built for the Autobahn, was now stuck in first gear, navigating a rocky, uncharted mountain trail. And in the shadows, watching its every strained, clumsy move, were new architects from a rival superpower, preparing to pour sugar into its fuel tank. While Soviet conscripts patrolled the moonscapes of Paktia province, a parallel war was being designed in air-conditioned offices half a world away. The Afghan conflict presented the United States with a strategic opportunity of historic proportions, a chance to bleed its superpower rival, to avenge Vietnam, and to field test a new generation of warfare, all without committing a single American soldier to combat. The architect of this opportunity was President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. In July 1979, months before the Soviet invasion, he persuaded Carter to sign a finding authorizing covert aid to the Afghan resistance, foreign policy, one that would expand dramatically under President Ronald Reagan. This was not merely about providing weapons, it was about transforming a collection of tribal militias into a strategic lever. The execution of this vision fell to two key organizations: the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI. The CIA, under legendary director William Casey, became the banker, logistics coordinator, and strategic overlord. Pakistan's ISI, under General Akhtar Abdur Rahman, was the indispensable conduit and tactical manager. The relationship was symbiotic, though not always harmonious. The ISI funneled the vast majority of weapons and training, exercising immense influence over which of the 7 main Peshawar 7 Mujahideen factions received the lion's share. This ensured Pakistani strategic interests, chiefly securing strategic depth against India and promoting a Sunni Islamist rather than nationalist vision for a post-war Afghanistan, were baked into the conflict. Egyptian and Chinese Kalashnikovs, British WW22-era mortars, and anti-tank mines were shipped by sea to Karachi, then trucked in a clandestine convoy known as the Bear Trap to ISI warehouses near the Afghan border. The Mujahideen were grateful, but the military effect was limited. They could harass, but they could not decisively challenge Soviet control of the air or break its armoured convoys. The turning point in this covert strategy came with a deliberate doctrinal shift in Washington. S-Army was formally developing what would become AirLand Battle Doctrine. Its core tenets were agility, depth, initiative, and synchronization. It emphasized striking enemy follow-on echelons deep behind the front line, disrupting their operational plan, and relying on technology to create overwhelming local superiority. While designed for NATO, its principles were eerily applicable to the Afghan battlefield. How could a light, dispersed force disrupt and degrade a heavy, centralized one? Under this intellectual framework, the CIA's support evolved from simply arming the Mujahideen to systemically upgrading their method of war. The goal was to inject specific surgical capabilities that would attack the Soviets at their most vulnerable points. This required a shift from deniable, obsolete weapons to cutting-edge, purpose-built systems. It was a decision that would collapse the distance between the Pentagon's wargaming tables and the Hindu Kush. 3 critical vulnerabilities in the Soviet system were identified. 1. Air dominance. The Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship was the terror of the battlefield, a flying tank that could decimate Mujahideen formations in the open. It represented the Soviet ability to project power anywhere, rapidly. 2. Armoured mobility. The BTR, BMP and T-62 tank were invulnerable to rifle fire. They allowed the Soviets to move and resupply along key highways, maintaining their garrisons. 3. Fire-based security. Soviet and Afghan Democratic Republic (DRA) outposts relied on heavy mortars and artillery to dominate the surrounding area. Attacking them was a costly, often suicidal endeavour for lightly armed guerrillas. To shatter these pillars, the pipeline began to deliver tools that were not just weapons, but vectors of a new doctrine. British blowpipe and later vastly more effective American FM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS, were sent to attack the first vulnerability. Swiss Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons, used in a ground role, and British Milan and American-designed TOW anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs, were supplied for the second. And for the third, long-range 120mm mortars and, most devastatingly, sophisticated remote-controlled mine and demolition equipment. This was not a haphazard weapons transfer. It was the creation of a system. Mujahideen commanders were brought to training camps in Pakistan and later to secret facilities in the United States, not just for weapons instruction, but for courses in guerrilla tactics, sabotage, communications, and combined arms operations on a small scale. They were taught how to use reconnaissance to plan complex ambushes, how to synchronize the firing of an ATGM with a mortar barrage and machine gun crossfire. They were learning, in essence, the principles of mission-type tactics and decentralized execution, the antithesis of the Soviet model. By mid-1986, the stage was set. The Soviet 40th Army, increasingly weary and tied to its static defenses and predictable convoy routes, was now facing a resistance movement undergoing a silent, technological revolution. The unseen hand of American strategy was preparing to close around the throat of the Soviet war effort. The first, most dramatic squeeze would come from the sky, changing the very atmosphere of the war. For the young men of the Soviet Union, the war arrived not with a declaration, but with a summons. The draft notice was an immutable fact of life, but destination Afghanistan carried a unique, whispered dread. They were not the professional, motivated Spetsnaz of the initial invasion. They were boys from the factories of Sverdlovsk, the collective farms of Ukraine, the sleepy villages of Siberia, drafted for 2 years of service, now shipped to a land that felt like another planet. Their war was defined not by grand offensives, but by a constant, grinding anxiety. The enemy was a phantom. There was no front line, only a permeable, hostile environment. A day's patrol from a fortified outpost could be a monotonous trudge through blinding dust or sucking mud, the tension a live wire in every soldier's chest. The landscape itself was the adversary, searing heat that warped rifle stocks and caused heatstroke in full-body armor, winter cold that froze diesel fuel and sent men to huddle around makeshift stoves, altitudes that left conscripts from the flat plains gasping for breath. Life inside was a surreal blend of boredom and terror, long hours of sentry duty watching the same empty mountains, the mind-numbing routine of cleaning weapons, digging latrines and waiting. Then the sudden, shocking violence, the crack thump of a distant sniper's round, the whoosh of RPGs arcing over the walls at night, the stomach-churning discovery of a booby trap on the path to the water pump. The local population was a wall of silent, inscrutable hostility. There were no hearts and minds to win, only a deep, mutual fear. Every elderly man could be a spotter. Every child could be used to lure a patrol. Every seemingly abandoned village could conceal an ambush position. This bred a corrosive paranoia that often erupted into indiscriminate violence. A nervous gunner on a BMP opening up on a shepherd and his flock. A brutal cordon and search operation after a mine attack. Each act of retaliation swelled the ranks of the Mujahideen, a cycle the conscripts dimly understood but were powerless to break. They returned home not as heroes of the internationalist duty, but as strangers. They bore invisible wounds, the 1,000-yard stare, the nightmares, the addiction to the cheap narcotics readily available in garrison, the cynicism born of seeing the hypocrisy of their mission. They were the human substrate of the Soviet war machine, confused, isolated, and increasingly aware that the grand doctrine they represented was irrelevant in the face of a scattered, determined enemy who fought by different, infuriatingly effective rules. The Mujahideen did not start the war as a professional guerrilla army. They began as local defenders, their tactics rooted in centuries of tribal conflict and the hit-and-run skirmishes of mountain warriors. Their initial engagements were often brave but costly frontal attacks on Soviet positions. What transformed them into a lethally efficient insurgency was a painful process of Darwinian adaptation, systematically nurtured and accelerated by foreign training. The core of their tactical evolution was the abandonment of holding fixed positions. They learned to cede space to Soviet firepower. Their strategic geography became the base and satellite system. Secure base areas deep inside Pakistan, like around Peshawar and Quetta, served as logistics, training, and medical hubs. Within Afghanistan, in impregnable valleys like the Panjshir, commanded by Ahmad Shah Massoud, or Jawar in Paktia, they established elaborate cave complexes, fortresses with workshops, hospitals, arms depots, and living quarters immune to aerial bombardment. From these bases, small, mobile groups of 15 to 50 fighters would radiate out like satellites to operate in specific zones for weeks or months at a time. Their tactical masterpiece was the complex ambush. It moved far beyond simply shooting at a convoy. It became a synchronized ballet of disruption and destruction. Reconnaissance teams, often using new Chinese-made binoculars and radios supplied by the CIA, would monitor Soviet outposts for days, logging convoy schedules and routines. The ambush site was then carefully chosen: a narrow defile, a hairpin bend, a washed-out bridge approach. The attack followed a refined pattern. First, the zaseka, the blockage. The lead vehicle would be destroyed by a remote-controlled mine or a recoilless rifle shot, halting the column. Then the Ognavoy Meshok, the fire sack, would be unleashed. Pre-registered mortar and heavy machine gun fire from dominating heights would rake the trapped vehicles, suppressing dismounting infantry. At this moment of maximum chaos, the Udanaya Gruppa, the strike group, would move in. Fighters armed with RPG-7s and later Milan or TOW missiles would engage armoured vehicles at close range from concealed positions. Snipers would pick off officers and radio operators. The goal was not to annihilate every soldier, but to inflict maximum material damage, destroy the armour, burn the trucks, and then melt away before helicopter gunships or quick reaction forces could arrive. They were not fighting for territory, they were fighting to bleed the enemy's resources and will. This tactical sophistication required a decentralization of command unimaginable to the Soviets. a junior Mujahideen commander in the field, had the authority to plan and execute complex operations based on general objectives from his leader. He was encouraged to use initiative. This fluidity stood in stark contrast to the Soviet top-down model, creating a constant, unpredictable OODA, observe, orient, decide, act loop advantage. The Mujahideen could decide and act faster on the tactical level, turning every mountain pass into a potential trap that exploited the rigid, predictable movements of their mechanized foe. The technological transfusion into the Mujahideen was not an upgrade. It was a transformation of the battlefield's physics. Each new system introduced was chosen to systematically negate a key Soviet advantage, forcing the 40th Army to fight in ways it had never trained for. The Battle for the Skies, 1980 to 1986. Initially, Soviet aviation operated with near impunity. The Mi-24 Hind was an apex predator. Early manpads like the SA-7 Grail were thermally crude, easily decoyed by flares, and required a long, steady pursuit from behind. Pilots grew contemptuous. The introduction of the British blowpipe in 1984 was a psychological shock. It was a command-guided missile requiring the operator to steer it to the target, making it effective against head-on attacks. But it was complex and cumbersome. The true game-changer arrived in significant numbers in late 1986, the American FIM-92 Stinger. It was a fire-and-forget weapon with an advanced iridium fluoride seeker head that could reject flares and target the aircraft's engine heat signature from any angle. Its success rate was devastating. For the first time, the Hind pilot's sense of invulnerability evaporated. Tactics changed overnight. Transport helicopters resupplying remote outposts had to fly fast, low, and nap of the earth, jinking violently. Close air support sorties became less accurate and more reluctant. The Soviet Air Force had lost the low-altitude battle space, the battle for the roads. On the ground, the same story unfolded. The Mujahideen's RPG-7 was ubiquitous and effective, but required a skilled, brave gunner to get within 300 meters of a well-armored vehicle. The introduction of Western anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs, changed the equation. The British Milan and the American-designed, Egyptian-manufactured TOW were wire-guided missiles with ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. A two-man team could set up on a mountainside, far beyond the effective range of the convoy's machine guns, and send a shape-charged warfat punching through the side or top armor of a BMP or T-62 with surgical precision. Convoys could now be engaged from standoff distances, with the first warning being the explosion of the lead APC. This forced the Soviets to deploy ever more elaborate escort and screening patrols, slowing operations to a crawl. The battle for the outposts. To counter Soviet artillery dominance, the Mujahideen received long-range 120mm mortars. They could now shell bases from hidden reverse-slope positions, forcing the Soviets to live under a constant threat of indirect fire. Even more psychologically damaging were the sophisticated remote control devices and timed explosives supplied for sabotage. Garrisons never knew if the road outside their gate or the generator inside their wire was rigged to explode. This technological shift created a profound asymmetry. The Soviet soldier was part of a vast, interconnected, but increasingly vulnerable system, a system of helicopters, armored vehicles, and fixed bases. The Mujahideen fighter was now equipped with discrete, precision tools designed to dismantle that system, component by component. The individual guerrilla, empowered by a single launch tube, could now achieve strategic effects. The Soviet military command structure in Afghanistan was a masterpiece of rigidity, a perfect instrument for a war that did not exist. It was hierarchical to the point of paralysis. Orders flowed downward from the General Staff in Moscow, through the Theatre of Military Operations (TVD) Command, to the 40th Army Headquarters in Kabul, and finally to divisional, regimental, and battalion commanders in the field. Initiative was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. A junior officer who deviated from a plan to exploit a local opportunity risked censure, even if his actions were successful. The system prized compliance over creativity. This created a fatal operational lag. Intelligence on Mujahideen movements, when it filtered up from a patrol or a listening post, had to be processed through multiple layers of command before a response was authorized. By the time an artillery barrage was approved or a helicopter gunship sortie was scrambled, the guerrillas had long vanished. The Soviet response was therefore overwhelmingly reactive and formulaic. Respond to an ambush with massive area saturation firepower, answer a mortar attack on a base with a large, predictable cordon and search operation in the nearest village. The Mujahideen, understanding this bureaucratic rhythm, could plan their attacks around it. Commanders were often rotated on short tours, 12 to 18 months, to prevent them from developing localitis or personal fiefdoms. The result was a perpetual lack of institutional memory and a reluctance to take risks for long-term gain. A general arriving for his tour would launch a large, politically visible offensive to demonstrate vigor to Moscow, often repeating the same mistakes as his predecessor, with the same negligible results. The learning curve was reset with each change of command. In stark contrast, Mujahideen leadership was decentralized and resilient. A commander like Jalaluddin Haqqani in Paktia or Ismail Khan in Herat operated with immense autonomy. They received money and weapons from the ISI, but how they fought their war was their decision. They knew their terrain intimately, maintained deep networks of informants among the local population, and could make tactical decisions in minutes. If a commander was killed, his sub-commanders could continue the fight seamlessly. There was no rigid plan to disrupt, only a shared objective and a deep understanding of guerrilla principles. This fluid command ecology made the insurgency hydra-headed. Cutting off one leader did not kill the movement. It often spawned several new, equally motivated ones. The Soviet command was trying to play chess against an opponent playing a game of speed and adaptability, where the board itself was constantly shifting. The real center of gravity for the Mujahideen war effort was not in the mountains of Afghanistan, but along a 1,500-mile logistics chain that snaked from factories in the United States and Europe to the Khyber Pass. This pipeline was a non-linear battlefield, a triumph of covert logistics and strategic patience that became the circulatory system of the resistance. At its source was the CIA's Afghan task force. Their role was procurement, financing, and strategic coordination. Under the Reagan administration's policy of rolling back communism, the budget for Operation Cyclone ballooned, eventually matching the CIA's massive annual contribution of over $600 million by the mid-80s. This money did not buy American weapons directly at first to maintain deniability, but purchased vast quantities of arms from the global market: Chinese Type 56 rifles, AK-47 clones, Egyptian RPGs, Soviet block ammunition sourced from Eastern Europe, and later, specialized systems from allied nations like Britain and Switzerland. The physical gateway was Pakistan. General Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq's regime was a full partner. The ISI became the distribution manager, the trainer, and the political gatekeeper. Arms shipments arrived at the port of Karachi, where they were offloaded into Pakistani army trucks. They were driven north to massive logistics depots near Rawalpindi and Quetta, controlled by the ISI's Afghan bureau. Here, the weapons were sorted, and allocations were made to the 7 major Mujahideen parties based in Peshawar, with preference given to the more radical Islamist factions favored by Islamabad, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e Islami. From these depots, the most critical phase began: the journey into Afghanistan. This was handled by private transport mafias, Pakistani military trucks with civilian markings, and thousands of Mujahideen porters and pack animals. They moved along ancient caravan routes, the infamous mule trails that were invisible to Soviet satellite surveillance. Staging areas just inside the Afghan border, like the Jawa Cave complex, became massive forward operating bases where weapons were cached, distributed to field commanders, and where training on new systems often took place. The CIA's most consequential decision was to push for the introduction of high-technology weapons, government who feared escalation. But by 1985 and 86, the argument for force multipliers won. The pipeline began to deliver stingers, blowpipes, Milans, and advanced communications gear. Accompanying the hardware was a stream of field manuals, translated into Pashto and Dari, on guerrilla tactics, demolition, and small unit leadership. The pipeline was no longer just supplying an insurgency, it was systematically re-engineering it into a light, technology-enabled force that could execute a form of decentralized, deep battle. A crude but devastatingly effective reflection of AirLand Battle principles on an irregular warfare canvas. They were officially helping a fraternal socialist nation defeat backward bandits and imperialist agents. This ideological framework, essential for motivating a conscript army, began to crack upon first contact with reality and dissolved into dust over 9 years. For the Afghansi, the dissonance was immediate and visceral. They were not greeted as liberators by grateful peasants, but with silent hatred or outright violence. The socialist brothers of the DRA army were often corrupt, unreliable, and brutal toward their own people, making a mockery of the progressive ideals they were supposedly defending. The soldiers saw their own command structures' indifference to Afghan civilian life in the ruthless bombardments of villages and the mining of agricultural fields. The cause felt hollow, a cynical geopolitical game played with their lives as currency. This moral dislocation bred a powerful, inward-looking cynicism. The official slogans, "My vypełniamy internacjonalny dolg," "We are fulfilling our internationalist duty," became a bitter joke. It spoke to the scorched earth tactics, but also to the spiritual desolation they felt. Soldiers turned to Afghanets, a crude, easily produced opium derivative, to numb the boredom and horror. Chorny Tulpan, Black Tulip, the nickname for the An-12 transport planes that carried the coffins of the fallen back to the USSR, became a ubiquitous and haunting symbol of the war's futile cost. At home, the state maintained a facade of normalcy. The war was the undefined conflict, with casualties reported in sparse, clinical language, if at all. The returning veterans, the Afghansi, found themselves alienated. They could not speak of their experiences openly. There was no national discourse to process the trauma. They were often viewed with suspicion by a society that did not understand where they had been or what they had done. This created a generation of disillusioned, hardened young men, many of whom would later form the core of both criminal organizations and, ironically, the nationalist opposition to the very Soviet state they had served. The ideological defeat was perhaps more profound than the military one. The war stripped the Soviet Union of its moral pretensions, both in the eyes of its own youth and the watching world. It revealed the regime's cynicism and its vulnerability. The certainty of the Marxist-Leninist historical march had been stopped dead by the timeless, resilient resistance of a tribal society. The new Soviet man had been broken not by superior ideology, but by a simpler, more enduring truth: the will to defend one's home amplified by the tools of a rival superpower. Supplied Stinger missile in Afghanistan occurred on September 26, 1986. The target was a Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter over Jalalabad airfield. It was not an anomaly. It was the opening shot of a systemic shock that would reverberate through every level of the 40th Army's operations. The initial distribution of the missiles, beginning in the late summer of 1986, was cautious. CIA and ISI handlers selected small groups of technically proficient mujahideen, often engineers or mechanics from before the war, for intensive training in Pakistan. The training was rigorous: identification of aircraft, mastery of the IFF, identification friend or foe system to avoid hitting their own scarce planes, and most importantly, the rapid drill of the firing sequence, uncapping the tube, extending the gripstock, acquiring the distinct growl of the seeker head, and firing. The psychological conditioning was just as critical. They were taught that they held a weapon that could defeat the once invincible Hind. The impact was immediate and transformative. Soviet and DRA aviation losses spiked. In the final quarter of 1986, credible reports indicate over 24 aircraft were downed by Stingers. The statistics told only part of the story. The true victory was in the realm of operational psychology and tactical freedom. For the Soviet pilot, the sky was no longer a sanctuary. The rules of engagement had been rewritten. The old tactics, hovering to provide accurate rocket fire, making low, slow passes for strafing runs, became suicidal. The Stinger's seeker could lock on from any angle, and its speed gave almost no time for evasive action, even if the pilot's warning system chirped an alert. The very sound of a helicopter's approach, once a herald of doom for the Mujahideen, now triggered the scramble of missile teams racing to high ground. The Soviet response was a cascade of adaptations that, in effect, conceded the low-altitude battle space. Flight profiles changed radically. Transport flights to remote outposts, once conducted at a steady cruise altitude, now became terrifying. Nap-of-the-earth dashes, with pilots weaving through valleys at treetop level to stay below the missile's engagement envelope. This increased crash rates due to pilot error and mechanical stress. Resupply and medevac missions became slower, more dangerous, and less reliable, further isolating garrison troops. Close air support, the bedrock of Soviet counter-guerrilla tactics, was severely degraded. Attack helicopters and Su-25 Frogfoot ground attack aircraft were forced to operate at higher, safer altitudes, drastically reducing their accuracy. Bombing and strafing runs became more indiscriminate, dumping ordnance on suspected areas rather than precise targets, diminishing their military value while increasing civilian casualties. The flying tank had been caged. The Mujahideen, sensing this profound shift, grew bolder. They began to move in larger groups in daylight, knowing the once omnipresent aerial eye was now blinkered. They could mass forces for attacks on outposts without the immediate fear of being spotted and annihilated from the air. The Stinger did not just destroy aircraft, it altered the balance of intelligence, surveillance, and mobility on the ground. For the first time, the Mujahideen could operate with something approaching air denial, a concept central to AirLand Battle, which emphasized neutralizing the enemy's ability to see and strike deep. The shockwaves reached Moscow. Reports from the 40th Army Command painted a grim new picture. The chief of the Soviet General Staff, Marshal Sergei Akhromayev, famously lamented to a Politburo member in 1987, "We control the cities and the garrisons, but we cannot control the territory we have occupied. We have lost the battle for the Afghan people. Every day our soldiers are dying." The Stinger was the brightest, most terrifying flare, illuminating that dark truth. It provided the Mujahideen with a strategic defensive capability, protecting their base areas and supply lines, while simultaneously degrading a core Soviet operational strength. But the crisis was not confined to the air. On the ground, the Soviet High Command, desperate to demonstrate it could still project power and secure key terrain, prepared for one of the largest and most conventional offensives of the war. It would be a test of raw Soviet military might against the new, dispersed, technology-augmented reality of the conflict. It would be the ultimate clash of doctrines, and its outcome would leave no doubt about the result. With the air campaign faltering, Soviet strategy reverted to its foundational instinct, the application of overwhelming mass on the ground. The target was the vital road linking Gardez, the provincial capital of Paktia, to the major base at Khost. For 8 years, this 60-mile stretch of highway through the formidable Saturkandav Pass had been cut by Mujahideen forces under command of Jalaluddin Haqqani, besieging the Soviet and DRA garrison in Khost. The siege was a symbolic and logistical festering wound. Lifting it became an imperative for the new 40th Army commander, General Boris Gromov. The operation, codenamed Magistral Highway, launched in November 1987, would be the largest Soviet offensive since the invasion itself, a textbook display of conventional Soviet combined arms warfare. It was a force built for the European theatre. The operation involved over 20,000 Soviet and DRA troops, multiple motorized rifle divisions, a full airborne regiment, massive artillery groups, and unprecedented air support. Over 500 combat sorties in the opening phase. The plan was classic Soviet deep battle theory, scaled down for the mountains. A multi-pronged advance to fix and encircle the enemy, massive artillery preparation, and airborne descent troops landing behind enemy lines to block retreat routes. The objective was not just to clear the road, but to annihilate the Mujahideen forces in a decisive engagement. For the first week, the offensive appeared to follow the script. Soviet spearheads behind thunderous artillery barrages and bombing runs ground forward. They seized key high ground overlooking the pass. On November 28th, in a dramatic televised spectacle, an airborne battalion was dropped near the peak of Mount Laka to secure a critical flank. The world saw images of Soviet power in action, but the Mujahideen, forewarned by their intelligence networks, refused to play their assigned part. They did not stand and fight to be annihilated. Heeding the guerrilla maxim, they gave up space to preserve force. They contested the advance with harassing attacks, complex ambushes, using newly acquired Milan ATGMs against the advancing armour, and pre-registered mortar fire on choke points. They inflicted steady casualties but avoided decisive encirclement. The Soviet troops fought not against a concentrated enemy, but against the terrain itself, clearing meticulously laid minefields, enduring constant sniper fire, and watching their monumental logistical tail become a series of vulnerable, stationary targets. The critical moment came not in a grand battle, but in a negotiation. To secure the peaceful passage of the column through the heart of the Saturkandav Pass, the Soviets were forced to do the unthinkable. They parleyed with the local Mangal tribe, who were aligned with the Mujahideen. A temporary local truce was brokered. Soviet troops, having fought for weeks to get there, watched as tribal elders oversaw their passage. The road to Kost was opened in late December 1987. A massive convoy resupplied the garrison. Politically, it was declared a victory. Militarily, it was a devastating revelation. Operation Magistral had consumed colossal resources, resulted in significant Soviet casualties, estimated in the hundreds, and had only achieved a temporary, negotiated result. The moment the Soviet column returned to Gardez, the Mujahideen moved back in. The road was soon cut again. No permanent security was established. No enemy force was destroyed. The offensive demonstrated that even the full might of the Soviet combined arms army could not hold territory against a dispersed, resilient enemy who would not accept a climactic battle. For the senior officers and the observers in the General Staff, Magistral was the final, costly proof of a failed doctrine. It showcased every flaw: the staggering logistical burden, the predictable tactical playbook, the dependence on fixed routes, and the utter inability to translate temporary spatial gains into lasting political or military control. The Mujahideen, empowered by standoff weapons and a decentralized command structure, had turned the Soviet strength, mass, and firepower into a weakness. They had forced the Red Army to fight a war of attrition on the guerrillas' terms, where the metric of success was not ground taken, but casualties inflicted and resources drained. In Moscow, the political calculus shifted irreversibly. The reports from Magistral, combined with the chilling statistics on aircraft losses from Stingers, ended any internal debate. On February 8, 1988, Gorbachev made a televised announcement. The Soviet Union would begin a unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan in May, to be completed within 10 months. The decision was not based on a single lost battle, but on the cumulative, systemic failure demonstrated in operations like Magistral. The military machine, built to win World War III, could not secure a single mountain highway. The shock was not of a defeat in the field, but of profound strategic irrelevance. The climactic turning point was this quiet, brutal realization in the Politburo and the General Staff. The initiative had permanently passed to the enemy. The only remaining objective was to exit with a semblance of order and dignity. The war was over. The long, painful retreat of a superpower had begun. This decisive failure sets the stage for the unraveling. The Soviet withdrawal, executed under the terms of the Geneva Accords, was a masterpiece of military logistics and a monument to political failure. General Boris Gromov, commanding the 40th Army, was tasked with extracting over 100,000 men and their equipment while under constant threat of Mujahideen attack and while propping up the crumbling government of President Mohammad Najibullah in Kabul. The operation, conducted in two main phases from May 1988 to February 1989, was a fighting retreat. Convoys lumbered north on the Salang Highway, the same route they had entered on, now bracketed by Mujahideen positions, who, despite promises from Islamabad and Washington, harassed them all the way to the border. The final stage was a deliberate, staged spectacle. On February 15, 1989, the last armoured column crossed the Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya River at Termez, back into Soviet territory. The image was meant to convey control and orderly conclusion. In reality, it masked a devastating truth. The USSR left behind a shattered nation and a proxy regime it had sworn to support. Najibullah's DRA army, though well-equipped with left-behind Soviet tanks, artillery and aircraft, was hollow. It lacked the one thing Soviet troops had provided: the core combat power and will to hold the line. The Mujahideen, meanwhile, were fractious and exhausted, but victorious. What followed was not the immediate collapse of Kabul, but a brutal 3-year civil war among the Mujahideen factions, while Najibullah's regime, sustained by a massive final airlift of Soviet fuel and food dubbed the Berlin Airlift in Reverse, clung to life. The Soviet Union itself would collapse before its Afghan client, leaving the Najibullah government adrift. He finally fell in April 1992, and Kabul descended into a new, even more savage chapter of internecine warfare. For the Soviet Union, the immediate costs were quantifiable and staggering. Officially, 14,453 Soviet soldiers were killed, with 53,753 wounded and 417 missing. The true numbers, factoring in deaths from disease and later injuries, are likely higher. The material cost was estimated at billions of rubles annually, a catastrophic drain on an already stagnating economy. But the human cost to the Afghancy went beyond the casualty lists. Over 100,000 veterans returned with physical disabilities. Hundreds of thousands more carried psychological trauma, what would later be diagnosed as PTSD with no support system to treat it. They were a generation of young men alienated from their own society, many turning to alcohol, drugs, and crime. The Black Tulip had delivered not just coffins, but seeds of deep social discontent. The military institution itself was in a state of profound crisis. The war had exposed catastrophic failures in training, equipment, and doctrine. The conscript system had produced soldiers unprepared for counterinsurgency. The officer corps was seen as careerist and out of touch. The prestige of the armed forces, the pillar of the Soviet state, had been irreparably tarnished. It was not a defeated army in the traditional sense, but it was a humiliated and discredited one. Its confidence was shattered. In the coming years, as the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe began to unravel, this loss of confidence would matter deeply. Soldiers and officers, remembering the Afghan quagmire, would show a marked reluctance to use force to prop up other crumbling satellite regimes. Perhaps the most immediate and unforeseen blowback was the creation of a new global phenomenon. The Afghan jihad had drawn thousands of foreign Muslim volunteers, Arab, Southeast Asian, African, to fight alongside the Mujahideen. Funded by private Gulf donors and often funneled through the same Peshawar networks as the CIA aid, these Afghan Arabs, including a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden, were forged in the same crucible. They absorbed the tactics, the ideology of militant Islamist resistance, and crucially, the belief that they had defeated a superpower. They had witnessed firsthand how a motivated guerrilla force with external support could bring a giant to its knees. The training camps, logistics networks, and global camaraderie built during the war did not simply disband. They pivoted. The blowback from this mobilization would not be felt in Moscow alone, but in New York, Washington, Nairobi, and Bali. The Soviet army had withdrawn, but the waves from its defeat were only beginning to radiate outward, destined to reshape the security landscape of the late 20th century and redefine the meaning of asymmetric warfare. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 cannot be attributed solely to the Afghan war, but the conflict acted as a potent accelerant to systemic decay. It was a draining hemorrhage of capital, morale, and legitimacy. The war had brutally exposed the lie of Soviet invincibility and ideological vitality, both to its own citizens and to its restive Eastern European satellites. When protests erupted in East Germany and Czechoslovakia in 1989, the Politburo, haunted by the Afghan experience and facing an army whose confidence was broken, lacked the will to order another bloody, open-ended intervention. The Brezhnev doctrine of protecting socialism by force was dead, buried in the hills of Paktia. The Vietnam syndrome that had gripped the United States now had a Soviet counterpart, an Afghan syndrome that bred profound military and political risk aversion at the moment the empire needed decisiveness most. Within the Russian military that emerged from the USSR's ruins, the Afghan experience cast a long, dark shadow. It bred a deep-seated suspicion of counterinsurgency missions and peacekeeping operations. It reinforced a preference for overwhelming conventional artillery and air power to avoid the costly, intimate ground engagements of the Kishlak villages. This aversion would later manifest in the brutal standoff tactics of the First Chechen War, and again shape the initial, heavy-handed Russian approach to Syria. The lessons learned or mislearned in Afghanistan became part of the post-Soviet military DNA. Distrust of indigenous allies, reliance on sheer firepower, and a focus on short, sharp interventions with clear exit strategies. For the United States, the outcome in Afghanistan was heralded as a triumphant vindication. It was seen as proof that supporting proxy forces with advanced technology could defeat a superpower adversary. The CIA considered Operation Cyclone one of its greatest successes. This confidence directly fed into the planning for the 1991 Gulf War. S-Army, which had formalized AirLand Battle Doctrine in 1982, saw its principles executed with stunning effect against the Soviet-modeled Iraqi army. The deep strikes, the emphasis on air supremacy, the disruption of command and logistics, all were honed in the theoretical opposition to Soviet forces and validated in the proxy laboratory of Afghanistan. The Stinger missile's success bolstered faith in precision munitions and the concept of denying the enemy sanctuary. Zero launch. However, this triumphant narrative contained fatal blind spots. focus had been on the tactical empowerment of the Mujahideen to achieve a strategic blow against the USSR, with little planning for the political aftermath. Once the Soviet withdrawal was complete, American interest evaporated almost overnight. The complex web of relationships, the weapons pipelines, and the militant infrastructure were abandoned to local and regional forces. The very success of the proxy strategy created a dangerous precedent and a powerful, ungoverned legacy. The Afghan Arabs, now battle-hardened and ideologically fueled, turned their sights on new enemies, first the secular Arab regimes that had supported the West, and then the far enemy itself. The blowback arrived on American soil with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, whose perpetrators were directly linked to the Afghan jihadist networks, and culminated catastrophically on September 11, 2001. Thus, the aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War created a paradoxical historical loop. The United States, by leveraging a doctrine of deep technology-enabled warfare through proxies, helped defeat one empire. In doing so, it fostered the conditions for a new, non-state threat that would, 2 decades later, draw that same American military into its own protracted counter-insurgency quagmire in the same mountains. The victor of the first conflict became the frustrated occupant of the second. The graveyard of empires had claimed not one, but 2 superpowers, though through different mechanisms and across different decades. The war's ultimate legacy was the demonstration that, in the late 20th century, the greatest vulnerability of a conventional military superpower was no longer its opposite number, but a decentralized, adaptive, and ideologically motivated network. A network that could be empowered, intentionally or not, by the very tools of modern warfare. The Soviet command was not just stunned by a battlefield defeat, they were witness to the opening act of a new, more chaotic era of conflict. This brings us to the final reflective synthesis of these events. The Soviet-Afghan War stands as a profound paradox in military history. It was a conflict fought at the tactical level of squad ambushes and mountain patrols, yet its outcomes reverberated at the grand strategic level, reshaping global politics and the very nature of warfare. It was not a war won by the Mujahideen in a climactic, decisive battle, but a war lost by the Soviet Union through 1,000 cuts, each cut delivered by a tool, a tactic, or an idea that lay outside the Red Army's doctrinal comprehension. At its core, the conflict was a collision between 2 forms of time. The Soviet military was a monument to the industrial age concept of war, centralized, sequential, and reliant en masse. It operated on the timetables of 5-year plans and phased offensives. The Mujahideen, increasingly guided by the principles flowing from their foreign backers, fought a post-industrial war, networked, simultaneous, and reliant on the precise application of leverage. They operated on the timelines of opportunity and dispersal. The Stinger missile was not merely a weapon, it was a temporal weapon. It collapsed the decision-action cycle for the helicopter pilot from minutes to seconds, and it stretched the Mujahideen's operational reach from the confines of a canyon to the openness of the sky. The shock for the Soviet command was not merely the loss of aircraft or the failure of an offensive. It was the dawning realization that their entire paradigm of power, the paradigm that had won at Stalingrad and Berlin, that held NATO at bay, had been rendered obsolete in the harsh light of the Afghan sun. They were prepared for a symmetric war of steel against steel. They were defeated by an asymmetric war of silicon against soul, where the will to resist, amplified by targeted technology, proved more durable than the will to occupy. Historically, Afghanistan became the graveyard of Soviet certainty. It accelerated the internal rot of the USSR, discrediting its leadership, exhausting its economy, and traumatizing its youth. It provided the West, and the United States in particular, with a potent and ultimately dangerous recipe for proxy victory. The war demonstrated that in the closing era of the 20th century, the most significant battles were no longer just between armies, but between systems of organization and ideas. The final sobering reflection lies in the war's circular tragedy. The doctrine and tools used to bleed one empire incubated the forces that would later haunt the other. The mountains of Afghanistan did not just consume Soviet conscripts and helicopters. They consumed the very notion that superpower military dominance, built for a vanished form of warfare, could impose order on a fractured, resistant world. The stunned silence in Moscow's command centers was the sound of an era ending. An era where mass alone meant victory, and where doctrine was a dogma, not an adaptive tool. In that silence, one could hear the faint growing echo of the chaotic networked conflicts that would define the century to come.